Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us today. I am Maureen Ryan. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for 21st Century Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And today we are joined in our Long 2020 series by Adia Benton, who's Associate Professor of Anthropology at Northwestern University, and Jonathan Flatley, Professor of English at Wayne State University. And they're going to have what I think is going to be a really interesting and interdisciplinary discussion about field epidemiology, contact tracing, race, policing, protesting, and affect. And we'll get to that in just a moment. A few kind of programmatic things at the outset that I wanted to let you know. So we're live streaming on YouTube as well. You may be watching there. That is cool. You can leave questions or comments at any time in the YouTube chat. We'll be checking it periodically. You may also, if you're joining us in the Zoom, leave questions in the Q&A, and we will get to those when we get to the Q&A portion. So they're going to each give a brief talk, about 15 minutes, and then we're going to have some moderated discussion among our presenters and our director, Richard Grusin. And then at the end, there'll be kind of open Q&A with the audience. So at any point, if you don't want to forget your question, you can put it in there and we'll just get to it when the time comes. We'll aim to go about 90 minutes, less if it feels like we've all been satisfied with the discussion. And I think maybe that's all you need to know. I'm going to introduce our speakers briefly, and then I'll turn it over to Richard. So Adia Benton is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Northwestern. Her research concerns patterns of inequality in the distribution of and the politics of care in settings socialized for scarcity. And this means understanding the political, economic, and historical factors shaping how care is provided in complex humanitarian emergencies and in longer-term development projects like those for health. These concerns arise from her previous career in the fields of public health and post-conflict development in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. She is the author of the book HIV Exceptionalism, Development Through Disease in Sierra Leone, and the upcoming The Fever Archive, also to be published through Minnesota Press. Jonathan Flatley is Professor of English at Wayne State University. His research interests include the relationship between politics and aesthetics, specifically the ways that art and literature can represent and produce political feelings. His recent books include Andy Warhol, Chicago 2017, and Affective Mapping, Melancholia and the Politics of Modernism. He's currently working on the book Black Leninism, How Revolutionary Countermoods Are Made, which is about Black group formation, those moments when Black people come together as a group for whom collective action seems urgent, obvious, and vital, and when victory over the forces of white supremacy seems possible. And all of that talk of Minnesota Press publications reminded me that for the attendees of our events, we have a special discount code from the University of Minnesota Press. So we have a lot of University of Minnesota Press authors contributing to our Long 2020 series, which is also itself going to be published as a Minnesota edited collection sometime next year. So I'm going to drop that code in the chat, which I believe people can see. If not, maybe I'll throw it in the Q&A too for good measure. And that's good for 40% off all of the Minnesota titles that are related to the Long 2020. That includes Centered C21 published books and all of the books published by the authors here. So we have a list of those on our website. I'll throw that link in the chat too, and feel free to browse that discount at some later point. I think that's all. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Maureen. I'm really happy to be here today to welcome my old friend, Jonathan Flatley, and now my new friend, Adia Benton. This is the third in a series of colloquia that we put together in conjunction with the Long 2020 volume that Maureen mentioned. Maureen and I are co-editing that volume, and it's Minnesota Press centric, partly because part of our planning was, not all of our planning, but part of it was done in conjunction with the press, who is pretty excited about the volume, as we are as well. So we're having, these are sort of preliminary talks to give people a chance to begin thinking through their work on the projects. it's been a year, just been a year since COVID pandemic was declared. So it's been a long 2020 of COVID, but the 2020 was not only about the COVID pandemic. And one of the issues that ran through, or that really intensified in 2020, an issue that's been really a problem for a long time since, well, whatever, it's been a problem for a long time, is the question of police and policing and police violence, police illegality, and so forth. And that really came to a head in 2020. But as with the virus and pandemics in general, it's something that has legs, extends before 2020, and will continue beyond that, at least until we can abolish the police. In any event, enough editorializing, and looking forward to hearing both Jonathan and Adia. And I think we're doing reverse alphabetical order today. It's a radical move. So Jonathan, floor is yours.
Hey, thanks, Richard. It's an honor to be here with Adia, and I'm really taking seriously the idea that this is an opportunity to present preliminary thoughts as I think through the questions that I'm trying to address here. And the title of my little thing is "Everybody Hates the Police." And I should say I'm not, or not yet, by any means, have I mastered the kind of vast, impressive body of work on the history and theory of the police, but motivated by recent history and by my own experiences, I'm trying to think about how hatred for the police might be or might lead to revolutionary feeling. Or in any case, I'm just trying to figure out what that feeling, hatred for the police, is. Because it's really true that I never hated the police as much as I did this past summer. No doubt this is connected to the fact that I saw them beat and arrest my friends and comrades all through the summer here in Detroit, where I live. In response to the brutal police murder of George Floyd, one of so many such murders, we were protesting racist police violence along with people around the world. Such monstrous indifference to life captured on film for all to see it has to be exceptional, one thinks. But then you do a little research and you learn that police kill someone in the United States on average 3 times a day. And then you see that the police themselves are more than ready to direct violence against people just expressing their view that the police should not murder citizens. This past summer, I saw that the violence Detroit police direct towards the protesters is indeed enthusiastic and energetic. They seemed to genuinely enjoy inflicting harm. They're expressing their feelings. And then they boldly lie. It was the protesters who were violent, the police say. We had to beat them up. But, I was there. And if I wasn't there in person, I was watching it on live feed on Facebook with the thousands of others who are also watching it. And along with all those others, I know that the police are lying. But of course, the police don't seem to care. They don't even fear being caught in their lies. Seeing this, of course, produces a bad feeling. And then over the summer on the same, computer screen where I saw the Detroit police lying, I saw the police beating protesters in Minsk, grabbing them and pulling them into vans. I saw the monstrous president of Belarus carrying a machine gun. as if he was the chief of police. And I guess that's what it's come to. The political leader is at bottom the chief of police, or at least he's trying to be seen as the chief of police. In any case, it seemed this summer that wherever the latest news directed my attention, Nigeria as well, the police were beating protesters with their shields and their helmets and their masks and their chemical weapons. Were the police always this evil? Maybe. It's an institution that's inspired a whole lot of negative feelings over the years, that's for sure. And I have to say that I have thought often over the last few months of that chapter in Harriet Jacobs's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl called Fear of Insurrection, where Jacobs talks about the responses to Nat Turner's insurrection, when the annual tradition of a muster, when every white man shouldered his musket, she writes, became even more violent than usual. She knew, as she said, that country bullies and poor whites would be searching every house. She writes that it was a grand opportunity for the low whites who had no Negroes of their own to scourge. They exulted in such a chance to exercise a little brief authority and show their subserviency to the slaveholders, not reflecting that the power which trampled on the colored people also kept themselves in poverty, ignorance, and moral degradation. Those who never witnessed such scenes can hardly believe what I know was inflicted at this time on innocent men, women, and children, against whom there was not the slightest ground for suspicion. Racist violence carried out on people for whom there was not the slightest ground for suspicion, with impunity, and indeed with positive exultation at the chance to exercise authority. It seemed like this is certainly something that I was also observing this summer. So clearly this phenomenon has a long history, one that runs, of course, right through the Black Panthers. And there's also something quite powerful, I think, in feeling oneself connected to that longer history, as if this long history is an event that's still open and that could still be turned through our current actions in another direction. It enlarges the collective that one feels a part of. But this particular historical moment, the summer of that long 2020, also had its own specific feeling. As the Invisible Committee, writing from the French situation in 2017, put it, it resembles a physical law. The more the social order loses credit, the more it arms its police. The more the institutions withdraw, the more they advance in terms of surveillance. The less respect the authorities inspire, the more they seek to keep us respectful through force. I mean, I think this is a whole, I'm not going to say a lot about it now, but I think this question of the relationship between the state and the police is obviously a huge one and a site of a lot of debate, not only the relationship between the state and the police, but also between the police and capital. So I don't want to dive right into the middle of that debate, except to observe that this phenomenon where, as the social order is losing legitimacy, the violence of the police and the amount of arms the police have seem to be increasing in direct proportion. We all know that the neoliberal state has been about withdrawal of services. It would be hard to argue these days that the social order is not losing legitimacy from all, political quarters. Still, I think the failure to perform even the most basic functions of government during the COVID-19 pandemic alarmed and surprised many people, especially when it was piled on top of the president's overt, frequent racist utterances and actions, and the imprisonment of children on our southern border, along with, the whole list of outrages. So, so here we have, on the one hand, the national state and local governments, which citizens really need at the moment of the pandemic to deliver the resources that they need to just like stay alive. We have the government's not providing those resources. Instead, the state seems, indifferent or just actively hostile to the lives of its own citizens. And, that's a sobering and tiring, I think, thing to know on a daily basis, and to need to reflect on. Fantasies about the nation and what the nation can do start to wither in such a situation. But I think it can also be radicalizing, so that then, in that situation, when we see the police like openly murdering people and then openly beating people, peaceful protesters in the streets, that seems to redouble the violence we've already observed on the part of the national government. And thus it's like more apparent than usual the degree to which the violence of the police has to cover for the failures of the state. It becomes harder to see the police as anything other than a purely repressive institution, a sense that becomes undeniable when the police then responds to protests against police murders of Black people with even more violence. Is this, are we living, is this just a police state? One may reasonably begin to wonder. As the Invisible Committee writes, it's never a good sign when a democratic regime takes up the habit of having its population fired upon. Like a birthmark in the middle of the face, police violence gives the lie to the pretension of democracy. So I think, this is sort of one of the things that I need to think about more, and I'm hoping that people here have thoughts about this. But anyway, in what ways was the COVID pandemic obviously a sort of key situation that established a particular mood that allowed the protests this summer to erupt in the way that they did? Perhaps the new global slogan of the COVID era will be, "Everybody hates the police." The slogan, as the Invisible Committee observes, doesn't express an observation, which would be false, but an affect, which is vital. What does that mean? I think it means a couple of things. First, it's a vital affect in the sense that when one hates the police, as I was hating them this summer, it is unimaginable that any sane person could not hate the police. How could you possibly see what everybody was seeing and not hate the police? The feeling is akin to the one that Kant describes when he speaks of the aesthetic judgment of something as beautiful. To make that judgment is to feel like everybody else would also have to make that judgment. It's not beautiful if it doesn't seem like it's got to be beautiful for everybody, even if on some level we know that this isn't true, that others won't judge it as beautiful, that others won't hate the police, that others indeed love the police. The feeling itself, nonetheless, has this powerful collectivizing impulse. It wants to find confirmation with other people. Did you see that? Can you believe that shit? And one wants to express that feeling in collective action. Second, this is the question of like, what do they mean when they say this hatred for the police is a vital affect? Second, and relatedly, hatred, as Lara Cohen and Brian Connolly pointed out in their great theses on hating, hatred is dialectical. We hate some things because we love others so fiercely, they write. And for sure, my hatred for the police was also, and at the same time, my love for my friends and my comrades that the police were beating and arresting. But I think this hatred is dialectical in another sense too. Within it also lies a kind of hope. So hatred of the police, as I'm thinking of it here, is what Ernst Bloch called an expectant emotion. The intention of expectant emotions, Bloch remarks, point ahead. The temporal environment of its content is the future. The closer that future seems, the more extensively it affects the intending self, the more totally the person throws himself into it, and the deeper it becomes a passion. That's Bloch. In this sense, hatred of the police it's in this sense that hatred of the police can become a passion. Hatred of the police intends the abolition of the police. And the larger the group of people assembled in hatred of the police, and thus the nearer the goal of its abolition seems, the more powerful the feeling of hatred is. In other words, you can't feel that hatred of the police with such power unless you feel like you're part of a collective that might actually have the power to abolish the police. And thus hating the police also exceeds or extends beyond what Bloch calls that feeling's founding content, the racist violence of the police themselves. In other words, the expectation, the imagination of a future, the intention that's inside the hatred of the police is greater than its cause. This fulfillment correlate, the fulfillment correlate of this hatred, to use Bloch's language, is what I mean is it's much more than the mirror image of police violence. And Bloch's examples are fear, which can sort of imagine hell let loose, or hope, which imagines the highest good, a kind of bliss let loose, or despair, which can be occasioned, as this despair prone among us know, by sort of relatively slight causes. Despair, which imagines sort of complete ruin. So to the hatred for the police that I felt with others this summer imagines much more than like revenge or a similar violence enacted in response. It instead imagines a world where the police are not necessary, where the police have been erased, where there will never be police again. Anyway, it's interesting to think about the Panthers in this light too. And I was watching this newsreel made, at the time. There's this group of women out in front of the courthouse chanting, no more brothers in jail, off the pigs. And thinking about it sort of, am I losing I hear that my internet connection is unstable. Sorry about that. And I'm just about out of time. I have one paragraph left. That's to say, this hatred imagines an unreal object. It pictures that unreality in anticipatory waking dreams. This isn't just like utopian dreaming, however. It's not a way of escaping from and thus affirming the present world by imagining some other one, because it's a feeling that's still oriented toward the world and directed towards it. In hating the police right here in front of me, in Detroit, in Minsk, in Moscow, in Lagos, in Paris, one is at the same time living a waking dream in which another world is possible. This, Bloch also asserts, means that the feeling is capable of conversation with the new. It's by way of such feelings that we become open to something else, something new. In such states with such hatred, we're capable of letting go of former attachments and of opening ourselves to an unfolding event. Thus, this summer, I feel like it was not just that police abolition was new as an idea, but I think that for very many people, it became a new kind of object of emotional intention. It became something that people actively wanted. I have a couple more things to say about the police, but I'll just skip right to the end. And just to say two things. One, it seems important that this hatred is global. It's international. It's a political feeling, the only political feeling, one of few political feelings that seems to circulate across national borders. And so, in a way, my motivating question is to ask, the world, can all those people who hate the police create together?
Jonathan, you want to read your last sentence you bugged out?
Sure. So I had just said that it seemed important that the phenomenon was international, right? That it was a feeling that could circulate and cross international borders. Maybe the only political feeling, or certainly a singular political feeling in that globality that sort of communists, anti-communists, people of different national and political stripes seem to share this hatred of the police. And then, sort of my final question, or really my motivating question, is to ask, what kind of a world can all those who hate the police create together?
Great, thanks. A lot to talk about. So, Adia, would you like to?
Sure. So I'm wondering if I could keep this under 15, just to kind of get the conversation started. That was super provocative, and it had me thinking about what I've been trying to deal with or move through, and affect and aesthetics actually, they matter. But one of the things that I've been thinking about, or I've been writing about, or had been writing about during the West African Ebola outbreak, which lasted between 2014 and 2016, was I was focusing on two kind of movements, or two moves that the Sierra Leonean state was making. One was militarizing an epidemic response and securitizing an epidemic response. The way that I was, there's a literal way that this happened, and the literal way was an epidemic response usually is handled by a Ministry of Health, usually. But in this case, the government of Sierra Leone moved responsibility to from the Ministry of Health to the Ministry of Defense. And this was a bit of a controversial move, because people wondered what happens when you decide to take when you apply the logics of the military to the provision of care. But that presumes that public health actually is concerned with the provision of care. In the case of the Ebola epidemic, and one of the arguments that I was making a long time before it began, was that public health has a martial politics at its root, which is that it is often preoccupied with, and maybe I should say US public health in particular, often concerned with containment, isolation, and protection. And whether that is the isolation and containment of people who are infected, it is also the containment and isolation of economic, the movements of goods and capital. I spoke out against militarization. It happened anyway. But one of the things that was also notable about this outbreak was Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, which has long sort of tried to dissociate itself from militaries, national militaries, foreign militaries, actively recruited and called upon military logistics to aid and assist in the rollout of the provision of care. One of the things that I did as a result of that was I actually was asked to write with Doctors Without Borders, to look into their archives and understand what brought them to make this decision. The brief summary is, for at least a decade, global health and militaries were involved in global health in the sense that they were sort of trying to develop pandemic preparedness across borders. And what that looked like was being able to understand the potential for certain viruses, certain biological material to be used as bioterror weapons, to be used as bioterror weapons. And so she was essentially saying, put your money where your mouth is. If you've been doing all of this work to equip the military to respond to outbreaks of Ebola, send them in. But don't bring your military logics, or don't bring your military might, only bring your military logics. And I was sort of curious about what that looked like. So that was part of the argument. The second, so there's the literalization, the literal militarization, but there's also the militarization built into public health response more broadly, which rests upon a bifurcation of public health as not clinical medicine, if that makes sense. So clinical medicine is about care of patients. Public health is about the management of populations, this very traditional sort of Foucauldian approach to thinking biopolitics, public health as a biopolitical apparatus. And then there's securitization that I was also trying to think through. One of the other issues is, if we're talking about bioterror and we're talking about national security, another paradigm for thinking about risk management and strategic risk was the security apparatus. What does this look like in the context of epidemic disease? It's something called global health security, which again sort of emerged out of the Cold War through Epidemic Intelligence Service. You might know those things as epidemic intelligence, disease detectives, et cetera. Again, emanating out of US versions of public health and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. A key argument that I make there is that you can't really understand the politics of health security without also understanding, in addition to Cold War politics, the racial politics of Atlanta, Georgia, from 1950 through 1980. And well, even today, but we can talk about that. So, as I'm presenting all of this work and talking about the literal militarization of an epidemic response and this sort of securitization that's built into public health, and the securitization of the landscape in a militarized or war-torn nation like Sierra Leone, what does all of this stuff look like when it comes together? What are the martial politics attending epidemic response, post-conflict development, humanitarianism? So as I started presenting all of this work, I began to realize that I was missing something. I was talking about the military, I was talking about security, but I was missing this piece that looked a lot like policing. The work of Stuart Schrader had me thinking about counterinsurgency and its global expansion, but also the way that discretion works differently in military regimes and policing regimes, which is to say, discretion operates at the interpersonal level when it comes to policing, and with the military, it starts at the top. So it's the general on the way down. I often, when I explain this to people, I say it's like A Few Good Men versus Rodney King, right? A Few Good Men, you have to get Colonel Jessup to admit that he ordered the code red. I hope everyone gets that analogy. With Rodney King, the police officers who encounter him decide that he is dangerous and possibly on PCP and begin to beat him. So the level of the way violence operates is that where the discretion is manifest. So what does this have to do with like Black Lives Matter along 2020? What does it have to do with COVID-19? What does it have to do with my thinking about the Ebola epidemic in West Africa? The big thing is, well, maybe I'll tell it from the perspective of something that happened on May 30th in 2020, which was as protests were picking up in Minnesota, one of the law enforcement officials did a press conference to say, well, we're looking for these people who are protesting and organizing terroristic violence around Black Lives Matter protests and Antifa and anti-Antifa movements. And during the press conference, the official says, we're treating this like contact tracing, which you people understand from COVID. And, I paused, but I didn't pause because he said it, because I actually see the very obvious links between contact tracing and policing. But what was really striking to me was how public health people said, hey, I know he's just using an analogy, but this is a misinterpretation of what public health does. This is a misinterpretation, and we want to disconnect or dissociate with the police. So, still not loving police. Everybody hates the police. Fuck the police, whatever. But the reason, so anyway, I've been kind of thinking about that moment because that was also the moment where I said, actually, let's talk about what public health is and what contact tracing looks like and why contact tracing actually has been failing in the United States. Often it's because it's disconnected from care. But if I sort of take this back to my Sierra Leonean case, one of the reasons I started to switch my thinking, or at least to begin to think along a continuum of martial politics, was because my friends were talking about what it meant to be a survivor, what it meant to be an Ebola infected person in June or July of 2014. To be an infected Ebola person is to be interrogated about who you come into contact with. It's to be possibly turned in by a neighbor who might have another kind of dispute with you. It's to be fined. You are fined if you're harboring an Ebola suspect. And this process of contact tracing began to look like police interrogation. It put people in when it was disconnected from something that looked like care. So ineffective care was the norm in June, July of 2014. But when contact tracing is not immediately linked up to adequate care, good care, quality care, it is immediately understood for what it is, which is disease policing. And it emerges out of one of the, and this is COVID-19 is not the first time we had contact tracing, right? Contact tracing is a public health strategy. It's used in sexually transmitted infections. It's used for all of these things in public health departments, many of which are underfunded, many of which are understaffed, many of which have very limited resources to do this work. And so this insistence of dissociating public health from policing, from martial politics connected to military, to security paradigms, appeared to be a protest without legs. So I've been so that's been my thing, is trying to kind of trace out the ways in which these different techniques and strategies of public health map onto the martial politics of, say, US racial hierarchies, global racial hierarchies. And that's sort of like the thing that I'm trying to I'm playing with, is that, this fight, which I actually also had with friends who were CDC employees working in Guinea, working in Sierra Leone, working in Liberia, where again, in August 2014, when we were having protests, Black Lives Matter protests in the United States, this was also when a slum in Monrovia, Liberia, was experiencing an Ebola lockdown and violence from the military and the police for trying to evade quarantine to go to work, for trying to get food and resources in lockdown. And so I've been, again, playing with what did it mean to talk about Black Lives Mattering on both sides of the Atlantic, when public health paradigms and regimes, again, have at its root, have, ideological underpinnings, state violence, the threat of state violence in the name of isolation, containment, and prioritizing containment and isolation over something that looks like care. And that's where I'll end.
Thank you. Okay, I have questions. You may have questions or comments from each other, but I guess I'll start with this one, and really kind of to put the two of you in conversation, I hope, even more. I thought the papers were really interesting in their divergent focus, not their divergent politics, but in Jonathan's interest in individual and collective feelings, grounded in his own hatred of the police that intensified this summer, but then how to turn that, or seeing that as something more collective, first in Detroit, then the US, and globally as well. And Jonathan, you ended your paper by saying that you thought that this hatred of the police was one of the perhaps few global feelings, or, it's like shared feeling across the globe. And then Adia, you ended actually also, interestingly, by talking about global racial hierarchies, with the idea that in fact, another perhaps feeling, or at least structure of feeling, that one can see across nations is structure of feeling of racism. And I guess that the question I wanted to ask Jonathan, I think dovetails with this, but then also, I know, Adia, you want to be in conversation as well, is, well, I'm really intrigued by the idea of hating the police as being universal. As a kind of avowedly historicist scholar, I'm wondering about the particular differences in hating the police in different historical contexts, different political contexts, and so forth. And in particular, what I was thinking of explicitly was the structural racism involved in the US in the hatred of the police, and whether that structural racism was present, let's say, in, forget what you were talking about at the end, but it was a place without, at least
Liberia, yeah. Liberia, which would has a US.
Liberia, exactly. And Jonathan was talking about, was it Minsk? And where structural racism in the US sense isn't present. I mean, there may be something like that. So anyway, I'm just interested maybe in having the two of you talk a bit about this question of globality versus particularity in a way in both of these, in both of your frameworks.
Do you want me to? I can go first. I don't know if I have anything smart to say, but I can go first. I mean, I'm just, I wrote a very short version of this up first for a Russian publication, because it was a publication on vocabulary for the era of the keywords for the era of the pandemic or whatever. And I was thinking about the police, and I was surprised at the degree to which my description of the behavior of the police and the feelings that the police produced resonated with a Russian audience. And so, whereas almost all other, either, whatever, I'm like a communist or whatever. So whenever I talk about communism or like anti-capitalism in the Russian context, that's sort of hard to, there's an allergy against that for anyone who grew up in the Soviet Union. It just seems it's kind of, you can't, it's not a viable political discourse. Likewise, sort of liberal pieties or, about rights or sort of any of the other kind of political discourses that might translate from the US context also fall flat there. But when you start talking about the police as sort of central to the maintenance of state sovereignty at the present moment, all of a sudden people are like, right, the police are sort of crucial. So, and then this summer during the protests, there were also huge protests in Nigeria against police brutality there. And then in Minsk, after the illegitimate election, after the sort of obvious cheating in the elections, and there were like hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, it was all about the police. Like the police were basically preserving sovereignty. And this is kind of the argument that the Invisible Committee makes about like whatever stage it is that we're in of like global capital is one where globally we're seeing the withdrawal of states from, Adia, what you were talking about as like the capacity for like actual care, right? And a situation in which governments are increasingly losing legitimacy, are not seen as legitimate by their own citizens. And so the police take on an increasing importance, which they increasingly are aware of, which produces different kinds of reactions. Sometimes it can produce a kind of ambivalence or anxiety. Why are we being asked to solve poverty? Or a kind of conservative, the police shouldn't be doing all these. Why is like COVID our responsibility? Responding to all these problems. Why is mental illness our responsibility? On the one hand, on the other hand, a kind of exaltation in the authority that they have in the knowledge. I mean, I sort of feel like anywhere, around the country, mayors are like totally beholden to the chief of police, right? It's certainly true in Detroit, right? It's like the chief of police, like, it's true in New York, right? De Blasio was like scared the whole time to cross the chief. You know, it was like the chief of police was really running the city, and the chief of police knew that, and the police union knows that as well. What's interesting is that seems to be an increasingly globalizing phenomenon. Why we think that's the case, I think, you know, depends on what our theory of, like, you know, global, what it is that's happening to governments and governmentality around the world, and if we can make comparisons to what's happening around the world. But there does seem to be an unusual degree of shared feeling of hatred for the police, as a vital affect, as an affect that sort of wants to be universal, even though it knows that it's not, right? It's not like I'm saying that the hatred of the police is universal, but that hatred for the police sort of, you know, tends towards this universality, this desire for universality. So I don't know, those are my initial thoughts.
I'm struck by, I guess as I was listening to that, I was thinking about some of the Nigerian calls for Black Lives Matter. Like that was also part of the discussion. Like if this is, I also have a friend who's based in Kenya who, you know, wrote me this very interesting, he's like always writing me these super interesting things as a gender and sexuality scholar who also studies African-American literature. And he asked me about officers, like medical officers, and how colonial officers all took on a kind of sort of para-policing something. I don't even know what to call it. Maybe it's a feeling. But I think the way that I hear the structural racism question is that that there are social orders that are also racial orders. And they may not look the same across all of these places, but we can certainly see how the colonial social orders are racial orders, and their persistence is through these mechanisms of like care understood through containment. And so I guess I was also in the back of my mind as Jonathan was talking, I was thinking about Blue Lives Matter, which also is about establishing this kind of racial, to me, it's establishing a racial order. That a racial order that's I think subtended by violence and the threat of it. It's homogenizing insofar as this particular form of state labor and state violence kind of come together. And maybe that's the relationship that we're seeing when we see a universalizing police order. I think for me, it's a little bit clearer in places like Liberia and maybe in Sierra Leone, because the colonial racial order persists, and it sits in, and the global racial hierarchies all are like obvious in a humanitarian space. So I was, going through these oral histories of people from the CDC who responded, and they talked about being able to distinguish themselves in the slums based upon skin color and the kinds of, NGO branding that they carried on their bodies. Which to me, so I've been, again, reading this through this politics of humanitarian concern, which I think has embedded in it this racial order or something like it. Again, even this, I feel like, I never want to claim Foucault, but here we are. That there's this, that even the biological order of survivor, non-survivor, immune, all of these things produce other kinds of racial orders too. They may not look like the structural racisms of the United States, where we see this hierarchy in terms of skin color and place of origin. But I do think that that's part of what the police are doing. If they're actual literal police, or if they're policing or police adjacent or quasi-police entities, the kinds of orders that they're producing and maintaining or reinforcing are racial orders. But I don't know.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. So, in a way, what you're suggesting is that a kind of racial hierarchy and a kind of, let's just call it, I don't know, police hierarchy if you want, that these two things are intertwined, and they they articulate themselves in relation to each other in different cultures and different political scenarios, depending upon situation there, because obviously police violence against other kinds of ethnic groups happens not just in the US, but in other countries too. So there's a kind of racial hierarchy there as well. I'm interested in the kind of thinking about this hatred of the police as a vital affect, and wondering, Jonathan, how you think about this in relation to Sylvan Tompkins or other kinds of other affect theories that suggest that there is a kind of physiological affectivity that is transcultural, and how the sort of hatred of the police as a kind of vital affect that goes across nations and across cultures hooks into other affective structures, both the feeling of pleasure that the police, sort of sadistic pleasure that police feel in exercising violence against these racialized others, let's say, whether they are Black or not. I mean, as criminals, that almost is, it's like blue lives and criminals is almost a racial hierarchy that can look like in the US, white and people of color. Anyway, I'm just curious about if you've been thinking, or how you've been thinking about the connection between affect understood as something not culturally constituted. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'm still thinking about the last question too, and about structural racism, and like how to think about structural racism in the post-Soviet countries. Certainly those people are racist in those places, and certainly the Soviet Union, the social order of the Soviet Union was a social order, and the police power in Russia, at least in the after the end of the Soviet Union, was constituted in relation to what were seen as racial, Chechens above all, but all of the people from the southern republics who were called in Russian Black. So it's even like a white-black binary in that instance. In Belarus, I don't know enough about to say about Belarus, how that's racialized. Certainly, there's an intense nationalism. But anyway, it's a different history than you see in like Paris or something, right? Where it's also, the police, and the social order that the police see themselves and say that they're protecting is definitely also a racial order, right? So those two things, right? But it's interesting. But anyway, it's quite interesting to see how these things resonate in different national contexts, but also the particularity of how the role that race / ethnicity / national identity plays in sovereignty in all these different contexts. So anyway, I'm just still thinking about that, but in terms of affect, obviously I was thinking about this Ernst Bloch stuff, and he's not thinking about, he's the question of universality or sort of naturalness is kind of outside of his purview. He's more just asking at this particular historical moment, he's trying to get into the sort of phenomenology of affect, right? Or this, and he's deploying he's back, he has a whole sort of complicated theory about the relationship between mood, which he's kind of borrowing from Heidegger as a kind of medium or overall context that allows certain affects to appear that then turn into particular emotions. So, hatred as an emotion would be something like what Sylvan Tompkins also calls an emotion, right? It's not one of the basic, if anger is sort of one of the primary affects, then hatred is a sort of compound of different affects put together, also with a set of ideas, right? So, what I thought was interesting in Bloch's account was this sort of sense of the dialectical quality of hatred as a feeling, he talks about a number of different emotions as having that quality. And he's thinking about their temporal origin insofar as they're expecting something, right? Insofar as they're anticipating something that's gonna happen. And I feel like the hatred, I was talking with Tristan Taylor, who's one of the organizers of Detroit Will Breathe here in Detroit, and who's, you know, had a leading role in the protests that I was participating in this summer, about this sort of anger and whether, you know, when it veers into like depressive anger, or when it veers into a kind of like giving up hope kind of anger, where you're just like shooting at the police because you've kind of, but you know you're going to lose, or you know you're going to get killed, so you're sort of giving up. The difference between that and the kind of hatred that we saw this summer, which contained within it this sort of hope for radical transformation. I mean, in terms of, you know, sort of thinking universally or sort of expanding across national borders, I think it has less to do with a universal claim about hatred and more about the shared nature of police around the world now in relation to modes of sovereignty. It's sort of, that's where I would look for sort of making those connections, is what's the relationship, what's the role that police are playing now in relation to state sovereignty that's leading them to be more violent and with impunity, and to sort of arrest tons of people. I mean, it's just, mass arrests are now just a common feature of life, I feel like, in a lot of places around the world, in a way that's quite mobilizing for people. So I feel like that's the question be, what kind of feeling does that phenomenon of the violent mass arrest produce in these different state situations?
I mean, Adia, you were thinking about police and military as well, and that relationship and the increased, as you said, militarization of police. And I'm just also wondering about what the differences are between police and military, and whether, you know, everybody hates the police, but does everybody hate soldiers? And if so, I mean, I don't really like the military much more, not like the police personally, but yeah.
That's the thing. So I think what's interesting is when I talk to different people about this in different audiences, like actually I remember giving a talk about, so one of the things that I've been writing about is the time the CDC became involved in a murder case in Atlanta. And because they, you know, and the police were actually resistant to the CDC being involved for reasons, but they said, well, I don't understand how what you do is any different from what we do. Your techniques don't sound very different from ours. It was in the newspaper in, you know, 1980. This was 1980. And when I talk about that story to people who've actually experienced, who've worked alongside the military in these humanitarian crises, they say, well, actually, no, the reason we like the military is because they're really organized. Like they're, you know, they have logistics, you know, there's people like the fact that there's a chain of command. And again, like what I was saying before, is that distinction between discretion, right? The discretion is up here for the military, the discretion is down here. And in fact, I worked with military nurses and doctors when I first worked in Sierra Leone. And they often said things like, well, we have a chain of command, we have a hierarchy. They're also the only people who are always paid. Police are not always paid in Sierra Leone. Like they may not get their money. And in fact, a story that I tell, so I would say hating police is probably directly related to where you sit in the hierarchy in Sierra Leone. So I remember I was telling a story about a friend of mine seeing someone who had stolen from her when we were out. It was someone that she was very close to and supported through school and everything. And she made us stop the car and pick him up, and she chased the guy and she's like, he stole all this money from my brother, blah, blah, blah. They said, hey, we would love to arrest this guy, but you're gonna have to get us some cab fare so we can take him back, or can we get in the car with you? And I was like, hell no. You know, and so I guess what I was saying is, what I'm getting at is they're under-resourced, and sometimes a joke, but if you call them on your very poor neighbor for disturbing the peace, breaking in, those people are very intimidated by the police because they can be locked up indefinitely. There's not a lot of, so there's a kind of, all of this to say, the police work for, or at least they help, they provide some semblance of security perhaps for elites. They secure the property for elites. There's also private security in Sierra Leone. There's a lot of that, those sort of transnational security companies that provide individual personalized security to managerial professional elites and so on. And that's very obvious. And so I would say people there's no loving police, okay? Like no one's loving police, but I do think that there's, when I was asking these folks this question, of all the civil servants who get paid regularly, who would they be? They're the military, because the military started the coup in 1992. You can't have them unpaid. It means that they also have pretty decent healthcare, mostly can get food. They have barracks and housing. And I think, we see the same thing in the United States, which is essentially that it's the only place that actually has a sort of socialist, the military is sort of the only community that has its own sort of bubbly socialist thing, in the sense that they will always get their paychecks and everything will be taken care of for the most part. The police and that chain of command and all of that stuff is sort of built into the functioning of that unit. The police are willy-nilly in our communities, operating with the discretion and the violence, which I think is, and so they seem to be a little bit less disciplined. They're entitled but undisciplined. And I think that's where the distinction is drawn, and that's how people that's how they experience it. But it's interesting to think about how in Sierra Leone, but not Liberia, not Guinea, you could call on the military to deal with the cholera epidemic, and in fact, they led the Ebola epidemic response, and they're actually in charge of the COVID response in Sierra Leone currently, not the Ministry of Health, which supposedly got $110 or $200 million to improve their ability to respond to outbreaks. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's sort of like, it's sort of the practice and experience that I think, where I'm sort of thinking about this question.
So I want to bring in a question. We have two from our audience members. And I think this one relates to what you're saying, Adia. It's also addressed to you. It's from Sarah Vanderhagen, who says, could you talk more about the conception of care that is animating your work? And I'd be interested in hearing both presenters talk about the relationship between care and hatred of the police or others, and how that relationship has structured this past year, or how it might structure conversations going forward. And I would also just anecdotally add, I've been wondering about this as well, and it hasn't come up in this conversation today, but there are part of what the Defund the Police movement is about is reorienting ourselves to be a society of care. And I'm interested in how, what's going to happen with that, particularly considering that no police department has successfully really done that. And there don't seem to be plans to do that in any substantive way across the country.
Yeah, actually, if I can just jump in, I was actually thinking about abolitionists' work. I was watching Mariam Kaba's her book release thing a few weeks ago, and one of the things that struck me during that conversation was precisely this question of care. Most of this, there are all of these. One of the abolitionists on the panel talked about how she was in this situation where she who hates the police, she who was called in to help a friend who was really hurt, needed assistance, and her instinct actually was to call the police. And she said she had to kind of take a step back and say, what is it that is necessary now that I think that I'm going to, that's causing this instinct to kick in, you know, because we all have the police in our hearts and minds, essentially, right? To some extent, we're trying to re-educate that tendency. And she said, she kind of went, okay, these are the things that I need. This is the thing that I need to make sure that this person is safe. And so she started to brainstorm, and the reason, so when I'm thinking about care, at least, you know, I think it's very easy to think of it in this epidemic sense, because it was essentially what this looked like during an Ebola epidemic was the people who were actually intended to provide care were saying, well, generally these things just die out. Let's just give these people a good death. You know, we can't really organize excellent care. Like this thing is just too hard. The treatment is too hard. I actually heard of people saying these kinds of things. And then there were Sierra Leonean doctors who tried and to some extent had experience saying, no, what we need is lots more clinicians providing this care. But what was happening was, okay, we just need to track these people down and keep them isolated from others until we can get a handle on what's going on with them. An example that I often use is one of the survivors that I talked to, one of the earliest survivors. So this was before quality care was implemented and all of these things. And people were sort of sending around WhatsApp messages about, this is what happens when you go to a treatment center, you die. So, you know, and then they use your organs or your body parts for things or whatever. And so this guy was in the isolation unit, and he escaped from his town and got on a bus and went to like Freetown or whatever, to the capital. And he was chased down and brought back. And he talked about this as, it was like a police chase. It was like a long, and he said, you have to understand, at the time, I was told about all the bad things that could happen to me. And I thought it would be better to find another place to be where I could be cared for than to come back and basically face a certain death. And so for me, the idea here is like, what happens when sort of containment and isolation, which I think is also a part of this it's a part of the policing strategy, but also this like weird sort of Cold War risk strategy, strategic risk thinking about containment and isolation. If you go to any security studies, whatever, they're all still talking about containment or whatever, risk management. And so it's like, what is care looks very different. And it is part of an abolitionist paradigm. It is part of an abolitionist ethos. And it's part of the social medicine tradition that I'm kind of trained in, where we think about it, there can't be containment over care. There can never be isolation over care. And in fact, if we're thinking about the potential for caring broadly, if we prioritize that, other things become visible, other methods for addressing the problem become apparent to us. And so I think the police is a really interesting way to think about that, because I think in so many ways it embodies the inverse of care. It is ultimately about order, and it's ultimately about the violent maintenance of orders that are hierarchical and inequitable. They're often on the side of securing property over the provision of care. So I know I could just use care to talk about care, but it's the thing that's sort of animating a lot of this work for me.
That's great. And I mean, that was a sort of question I had too. And I feel like there's even more to think about in relation to care. I mean, the only thing that I was, thinking is just that I feel like Black Lives Matter is about care, but it's about valuing Black life, right? I mean, it's sort of, as a movement, its basic sort of principle is, you know, how can we as a social order, as a society, value Black life? How can we combat the active devaluing of Black life by the state, right? So I mean, I see that. I mean, and this summer in Detroit, I mean, it was you know, inspiring to see how that impulse towards valuing Black life expanded quite quickly from the opposition, the hatred of the police, out to thinking about evictions, to thinking about access to water, right? It's sort of, once that sort of principle becomes an orienting one, then all of a sudden the failures of the government on a whole number of fronts become apparent. And I feel like that was something that felt different to me this summer about the protests, is the way that the hatred for the police kind of spread out to a critique of like the social order as a totality. Like and I think that obviously had a lot to do with Trump, and a lot to do with the failure to respond to the COVID pandemic as a sort of backdrop, as sort of established a kind of mood in which a particular emotion could emerge. But I wonder, I mean, it was a sort of active debate in the movement about whether that demand to value Black life could be met within the current government system. In other words, is the demand to value Black life, is that a reformist demand, or is that a fundamentally revolutionary demand? And people tended to think it's a fundamentally revolutionary demand. And so part of my, I mean, anyway, but you know, part of my question for you, Adia, I mean, I don't know the answer, but you know, is a caring government still possible now, or where how do we envision the caring government more robustly, or where can we see examples of a government that seems to be caring? Because it's, you know, it's sometimes it could be hard to see that and value it and pay attention to it.
Mm. That's a good question. We've been trying to think through that one. It's like, what is a governmentality? Is there such a thing as a governmentality that is caring? I don't know. I think, though, I wonder, again, I don't know how I'm on Foucault today, but this idea of caring for the flock. I think, but when you care for the flock, you still have to imagine it as a flock and it has to be contained. I've been asking that question to myself every day, and I don't know. I think that's, so I guess when I was hearing you say that Black Lives Matter as a revolutionary idea seemed revolutionary in 2020, I think in 2014, when it emerged as a thing, I do feel like the other debate was, do we just want to matter? But the fact that it is that the basic demand could cause a debate, I think raises this question about whether the question of value, so the currency of Blackness, the currency of Blackness is part of the problem. So in other words, like how fungible we might be. Which is I think a foundational part of US society, right? Like it's sort of, we can't think US society without that same sort of fundamental question of what it means to be currency, or what it means to be thought of as in terms of equivalencies all the time, or commensuration. And that's actually where I was doing that sort of Atlanta piece too, because when I started to look at these child murders and the CDC's involvement, the way that they sort of framed their involvement was always in terms of concern, and concern equivalent to or in reference to the mayor's concern. I'm living in Chicago, so I think about these mayors all the time who do not value us, and in fact, exercise violence against us whenever she can. So there, yeah, I've been trying to think through this, and but I do feel like the abolition people, the abolitionism is actually giving us some of the tools. And one of the things that I think is that Kava and many others are saying in this, Davis, is we may not actually have the answer, but we have to imagine it together. And that is what I took again from that story where this abolitionist is saying, what do we need? What does this look like? What does this moment demand that is not a police or whatever the police are said to represent in a moment of vulnerability, in a moment of loss, in a moment of hurt? And so, yeah, I don't feel like that's really an adequate answer, but it's like something that I feel like we're having to imagine for ourselves. And actually, one thing I wanted to say about the long 2020 is, for a first time in a long time, I've actually felt like the difference between, say, 2014 and 2020 was we all had to sit and we had to slow down. That's what made the 2020 so long. And we were in a place where we were actually having these discussions and debates in a much broader sense and with a much broader base of discussants and engagements, I think. This is why we're having an abolition conversation more broadly, I think. We can, a lot of us didn't have other stuff to do for once. Like, we could all kind of like go out, we could read, or we could not. We could just be on Twitter all day, whiling away our depression. So,
yeah, or sitting with our feelings about whatever it is, everything that it is. I have a question I want to bring in. Jonathan, do you want to reply?
Yeah, I was just going to say very quickly, I mean, it's just in the spirit of what you were saying, Adia, is that I completely agree about abolitionism, but it was remarkable also this time, 2020 versus 2014, how quickly the demand to defund the police appeared in the protest, like right away. So I feel like it's interesting to ask what changed between 2014 and 2020 that made that demand seem kind of totally obvious, right? It was that, it just was appearing on the first day I went out to the protest, that was on people's like signs and stuff, like abolish the police. It was sort of right away there. So I thought that was that was powerful and interesting to think about too.
Yeah. Well, a comment first from Lane Hall, and then I'll get to his question. He said what Adia said about care was so tragically illustrated here in Milwaukee. When Dontre Hamilton was killed at Red Arrow Park, there's a documentary called Blood on the Doorstep about this. Every city has these stories they can tell. Lane's question is, what does the January 6th insurrection do in terms of your thoughts? I'm thinking of all of the paradoxical issues that it brought up in terms of militant white supremacy, a professed love of police, the Blue Lives Matter people who were in that moment clearly willing to kill the police, while BLM marches throughout the country have been mostly quite peaceful beyond a bit of property damage, even though they profess righteous animus for the police. Is this merely explained by white positional privilege? Is there something more going on?
Adia, do you want to speak to the care thing first, or could you read the beginning of Lane's question again?
Sure. What does the January 6th insurrection do in terms of your thoughts? I'm thinking of all of the paradoxical issues that it raised in terms of militant white supremacy, a professed love of police, but those participants in the insurrection were also clearly willing to kill the police. And comparing that to the way that BLM marches, which were actually quite peaceful, although they professed an animus toward the police in their signage and their kind of embodiment, they were vilified in the way that some of the participants in the January 6th insurrections were not.
Yeah, it's a good. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, and it's one that's been on a lot of our minds as well. I mean, I guess I feel like the part of the effect of this summer also is that it made it difficult to not choose sides. It was a real "what side are you on" moment, right? Either you hate the police or you love the police, and you know the people who love the police are also plentiful, right? And you know, I have to admit that the love for the police remains a bit opaque to me. But I think that, you know, the insurrectionists seem, you know, along with the sort of all the people that, you know, in Michigan, as soon as you get out of Detroit, it's like Trump country, and you see the Blue Lives Matter flags or whatever flying everywhere. It's just a strong identification with the police, and it's just also an open identification with racism, with the sort of the idea of, you know, it's holding on to some idea of America as a white supremacist state, and with the hope that, you know, and I mean, and Christine's question up here is about care, and it's sort of like, it's like they can only imagine the government being a caring one if it's a white supremacist one only caring for white people, right? It's sort of, it's those two things somehow seem to go together. In terms of violence versus nonviolence, yeah, that's an interesting question too. But if the insurrectionists, if the Blue Lives Matter people are essentially, not only do they love the police, but they identify with the police, they want to be the police, they sort of fantasize about the position of the police and of, you know, it's a sort of sadistic pleasure of being violent, then it makes sense that at first opportunity, or when an opportunity presents itself, they're ready to be violent. I mean, I'm wondering too about I mean, it's sort of interesting to think, I mean, this is sort of opening another can of worms, but to get back to Adia, what you were talking about earlier, the sort of relationship between the military and the police here, and the degree to which, like, sociologically, so many of the police are former military. And I wonder how many of the Blue Lives Matter people are also ex-military. And I don't know the numbers, but I think the percentage of the population that's ex-military is not small. So anyway, I'm wondering about I'm just thinking about these sort of demographic and class things too. I mean, it's also interesting that the insurrectionists, as we know, it was a mixed class group. There's a lot of people with money. You know, this is the petite bourgeoisie, you know, or the sort of wealthier petite bourgeoisie, you know, flying to Washington as well. So anyway, this is overlaid then with sort of with class issues, which isn't really much of an answer to your question, Lane, which is a excellent one, but those are just my incoherent thoughts in response.
I was actually thinking, now that you mentioned this whole like police military, so that, I mean, we talk a lot about like the militarization of the police in the States because of the sort of surplus military stuff that gets pushed in and all of this other stuff. But I was also thinking about private security, like which ones kind of, you know, who gets to be contractors. So there are all of these weird state security, military police relationships that I think get, you know, juggled around. Also, you know, I'm thinking about broadly, like the way neoliberalism operates for security, how the government is able to hire, because a lot of private military contractors are people who are trained as military, who then have to, whose funding is now, or whose financial whatever is based upon this contract labor, where they're not actually a part of the same socialist kind of chunk of our society. So what does that do? And what about how do these private security companies work? All of this to say, I think it also disturbs a lot of the way white supremacy operates. I think that's why it's able to kind of hop around to conflict outside of the country and do some kind of work inside businesses, right? They usually are hired by businesses. I'm only saying all of this to kind of, because I'm confused, but I'm also trying to kind of talk through what that January 6th thing was. Because there were a lot of the people that I saw were in costume, and they weren't just dressed as, like, I don't know, Vikings or whatever, but they were also dressed as military or paramilitary. They were dressed like militia. And that cosplay has me wonder, like, what are they doing? Like, I don't know. It makes me wonder a lot about what is embodied, what is enacted, how that, what is being projected through this act of violence. People call it the attack on the Capitol and the nation. Oh, I wanted to say this because I'm not sure what to do with it, but I think it might be important, maybe for affect. I actually, when it happened, I felt like maybe I was actually like, good. Maybe these people in Congress will understand what some of us have been afraid of all along. I don't know if it's good to admit that, but I actually was like, you know what? Maybe some of these people need to feel the actual, like, this isn't about like playing nice across the aisle, but we are actually threatened by, physically, existentially threatened by white supremacist violence. So here it is knocking at your door. What do we do with that?
And I think I agree in the sense that it felt like the first time during the Trump presidency when words actually mattered, that a lot of the rhetorical cover that was provided to him by Republicans was like, well, what's the worst that could happen? He's just full of blood. He's all talk. And the rhetoric really came home to roost in that day.
Yeah, but I wanted to say to Adia's last point too, that I think some members of Congress did feel that for like about a day or two. And then their life of white privilege, which, reinforced them again and reminded them, they just forgot all that, because when you compare what people in Congress said then, Republicans, and what they're saying later, it's like night and day. The insurrection is a really interesting feature here. I know we need to wrap up, but I was also struck by Lane's question in thinking about, Jonathan, your formulation about how people are beginning to feel that the state can no longer provide care for us. And actually, the fucking white supremacists and, all those Trumpistas feel the same thing. They feel like the state can no longer provide care for them, and so we really have this, I guess a kind of Lyotardian différende, which doesn't get worked out through words or argument, but is now getting worked out, through violence. And so there's a collectivity on the other side too that's, I think not nearly as large and powerful as the revolutionary collectivity that we feel these days, but more violent, that's for sure. We're more willing to use violence because it's a police tactic and it's aligned with police. So anyway.
I feel like the Invisible Committee makes the case that, I feel like that's absolutely right. And I sort of tried to allude to that in my talk, that the loss of the legitimacy of the social order is shared across the political spectrum. Nobody thinks the government is legitimate. And maybe Republicans especially, it's liberals who are most likely to think that the government can still be good, right? Leftists and the Republicans are sort of opposed to, or think the government is illegitimate. But I feel like the situation that produces is basically a low-key civil war, right? There's no consent to be governed by the existing social order, right? So then the police, and just violence itself becomes crucial for exerting power of any kind. And I feel like that's what the insurrectionists are also aware of or know, right? That violent in a situation where the state itself is basically illegitimate, the exertion of violence, the use of guns becomes paramount. And so it's like they see the police doing this, they see the importance that the police now has in maintaining social order, which the government itself is also aware of. But then that also alerts kind of everybody to an open struggle for power using violence. And I feel like the insurrection is basically a sort of full-on indication that we're just in the midst of a low-key civil war, right? It's impossible to be in a polity with people who want to kill you, who openly, publicly are trying to kill you. There cannot be a legitimate social order with that principle, right? And so you have people like AOC, Rashida, I mean, they're fully aware of that. I mean, they get hundreds of death threats every day. So they're fully aware of the way in which they're being, they're threatened by their environment. And there they are sitting in this government with people who are openly supporting those who are trying to murder them. So that just seems like that's an inherently unstable situation in which violence is necessarily going to come to play a more and more central role, it seems to me, unfortunately.
And we're about at time, but I realized I did not catch Christine Evans' great comment earlier, so I want to maybe let her have the last word. So I will read this into the ether. She says, not entirely a question, but in light of this excellent discussion of care, which was about 10 minutes ago, I'm really struck by the way that pro-police and pro-military groups really mirror this discourse of the need for care. In this case, for policemen and soldiers themselves who are presented in effect as victims in need of care. And indeed, much of the attraction of violence work, police work, is the material social welfare benefits and access to public care and concern that those jobs have long enjoyed and actively promoted, for instance, through the propaganda aimed at US school children. And part of the outrage around them is that they are kind of worthy of our care and concern, and that the anti-police activism sort of denies them that. So we will leave it there. Thank you to Adia Benton and Jonathan Flatley. It's such a wonderful conversation, and thank you to all who came and asked great questions and made great comments.
I echo that.
Yeah. Our next Long 2020 chat is the same time next Friday with political theorists Libby Anker, Bill Connolly, and Bonnie Honig. Details on our website. Thank you again to everybody who came.